out to be more complicated.
Well, I can tell you from experience, you did a good job because most people freak out about it.
Well,
and Google Hangout doesn't
freaking
make
out
it that easy.
was done. There was freaking out.
Cool. Well, thanks for making time.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So tell me first off, I mean, obviously this is the start of a new series. You have quite a cliffhanger in this one. How do you know when, I mean, obviously you get an idea or you get an inspiration, it's exciting, but how does it then transform to like a very sure knowledge on your part that you actually want to spend years of your life writing about these characters?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I never really know in advance. You know, when I started writing Daughter of Smoke and Bone, it was just like one day of writing for fun. That ended up being 5 years and 1,500 pages. You know? So, and then in this case, I had finished those 5 years and 1,500 pages, and I had this, you know, opportunity to just really figure out, what do I want to write now? And coming off of that 5 years, I was really much more aware that this is going to be a big chunk of my life potentially. So, so it was exciting, but also nerve-wracking. And I just sort of thought, like, what are all the stories that have been in my head that what of all these things, what do I want to choose? And I sort of, you know, I'm a slow writer, so there's a lot of things bottlenecked in there that will probably never get to be written. And I wrote down a few ideas and started developing them, trying to figure out, you know, from how much I had. Usually it's just a character or a premise, and it's certainly not a plot. So this was one of the ones that I picked. And so this cat's like roaming around. This is one of the ones I picked. And I thought, you know, you always think you know a lot about it at the beginning, a lot more than you do. And once I start writing, then I realize it's this immediate education in how much I don't yet know. So this was initially going to be a standalone, but the further I got into it, the more it kept growing, until about 8 months in, I had to acknowledge that it was really, really sprawling, and that maybe it should be 2 books. So I brought that up with my agent and editor, and luckily they were cool with that. So then what had initially been conceived as one story arc, you know, it kind of had a natural split. But so that's how that happened.
Yeah. You know, one of the interesting things about writing fantasy, I mean, first of all, in this book, there's a lot of, you know, Earth problems going on, like slavery, the failures of memory, both sort of personal and institutional. I mean, there's this lost city that people are trying to find. And so one of the joys of writing fantasy, it would seem to me, is that you don't, you know, you can create these worlds that don't have to conform to our literal experience of life on Earth. But it always seems like human problems follow characters around in fantasy novels. Obviously, you need that emotional underpinning to get people engaged and to say something interesting. Does that ever frustrate you that real world problems always follow us into fantasy novels?
No, I don't think so. There's a line in the book, actually, where Laszlo acknowledges that, I think it's, quote, the imagination is always tethered in some way to the known. You know, that I think for us as humans and as writers, you know, what we can dream up is necessarily limited by what we have fed our mind over the course of our life, or what we've been exposed to. And some people might have access to, you know, something beyond that, but that's, I think, rare. And so, you know, no matter what you're writing fantasy, and you can combine elements from different cultures, and you don't have to be true to a particular historical tradition, but at the same time, I mean, we're still working from this pool of what we know as human beings. And so I think, for me at least, there's really only so far we can go. And, you know, sometimes you do read like science fiction novels where they've made a clear effort to sort of get outside of the bounds of human, what's, you know, known a little bit more, and create an alien culture. And that's really cool. And I find the idea like super difficult. You know, when you see it done well, it's challenging. But then a lot of the reader's challenge goes into sort of like interpreting that you don't have maybe the sort of emotional receptors for it. And so like a lot of your work as a reader goes into building up this sort of new ability to understand and contextualize something that's outside of our experience. And so like that can kind of, I mean, it's hard, but I think for me, the great benefit of fantasy is to be able to look at our problems with a new framework and hopefully, you know, have insight, or at least the ability to sort of pass along, you know, our own personal insight in a way that doesn't feel political or polemical or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's true. So our reviewer, in her review of the book, says that, you know, has this nice observation that Sarai is afraid of nightmares, but she also creates them for sort of citizens of the other people. Did you ever just want to like shake her and tell her to stop?
Well, I think by the time we meet her, you know, she's already been awakened to the reality of, you know, what she has done to herself.
Right.
And so we really don't need to shake her. I think she's already shaking herself.
Right.
But I mean, I think, you know, I haven't really thought about parallels sort of for what it is that has happened to Sarai when through the quest for vengeance and creating trauma for other people, you know, I guess it's like when you think about, I mean, maybe let's take the example. I haven't thought this through, so I don't know if it'll come across well. But like, you know, when we talk about one of the arguments against the death penalty is that somebody has to be responsible for carrying it out. And that's aside from the injustice and the potential, you know, however you feel about the death penalty itself, somebody actually has to be the person to do it. And what does that do to a person to have to kill somebody? And do we want to be a society that does that? And so I think in Sarai's case, in a way, you know, everything that she has done to other people has poisoned her. And that I think is certainly a risk of vengeance and violence. But I don't think we have to. I thought initially that she might be a darker character, that we might enter her story at an earlier stage and have to see her have that awakening. But there just really wasn't time for that. We had to meet her at a time where she's already grappling with the understanding of what she's done and suffering from the consequences.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So does Weep hold any sort of, you know, emotional or physical resemblance for you or affection for you to any place on Earth?
No, I don't think so. I just have always loved the idea of lost cities or imaginary fabled cities that may or may not be real. And there wasn't a particular one, but just the idea of a journey or a quest with an unknown, you know, destination, or being able to be part of a journey and see something, you know, kind of go over a hill and see a landscape that has never been seen before. It's just that's one of the things about fantasy, you know, we'll never get to have that experience, or very few people will ever get to have that experience on Earth anymore. But that's where I was coming from with that. And I have always loved like Silk Road stories and like the idea of the old Silk Road and, you know, like Marco Polo and other sort of Westerners who did travel to these places that would have seemed to them like Weep. There would have been stories, but just they're so otherworldly and so hard to get to. And I mean, just it has always completely fascinated me, these overland journeys. Yeah.
So last question. I'm sure our readers in particular will love the fact that Laszlo is a librarian. Tell me about the decision to become a librarian.
Yeah, so Laszlo he wasn't supposed to be the main character. So Sarai was the main character, and she always had been in my head. She was the starting point for the whole story. The Muse of Nightmares was going to be the title of the book. But early on, I decided that I wanted to experience Weep and Sarai, to meet them through the eyes of an outsider. And so Laszlo was the outsider who was going to come in and experience these things for the first time. And so as I developed him, at first I thought he was a scholar, maybe a scholar of magic who was a little bit ridiculed because nobody else believed in magic. And that wasn't quite working out. It wasn't quite coming together until I realized that he was a librarian. I mean, there was a lot of similarities, but sort of that finally fell into place. And also when that happened, he also emerged as the actual main character of the book, to my surprise. And the title of the chapter I was working on at the time was Strange the Dreamer. And so that. I just looked at it and I was like, oh my God, that's the book. But as later, after I finished the book, I think I started realizing the extent to which Laszlo himself in the book is sort of a love letter to fantasy readers and to fairy tales and all of these things that train our minds in a different way than other kinds of reading and make us, maybe more open and receptive to other ways of problem solving and make our minds just sort of more interesting and beautiful than people who don't read fantasy. So
Yeah. Nice. Well, great. Well, thank you so much for your time. And I also want to say, I'm the editor of Kirkus, but I do as a side job as the literary director of the San Antonio Book
oh,
Festival.
okay.
And you're coming, and we're like thrilled.
I am too.
Yeah, so we're gonna have somebody introduce you. She's great, and you'll, give a talk and do Q&A and sign, and then you'll go home.
It's great. So do you live in San Antonio then?
No, I live in Austin. Kirkus
Okay.
has an office in Austin and in New York, so
Okay.
kind of go between New York and Austin. But San Antonio is only like an hour from Austin.
Yeah, the one time I went to San Antonio, I drove down from Austin, and I went for TLA one year, and it's such a cool city.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to go back.
Yeah, I mean, Austin gets all the attention in terms of Texas cities for being like the hippest and coolest,
Right.
but I mean, probably like Portland, but
Because I expected San Antonio to be more like Dallas or Houston or something, but it's just got a lot of character and it's really pretty.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's much less self-conscious than Austin, and it's much funkier. So
Yeah. I mean, I didn't get to experience too much of it, but it was cool what I saw of it. So.
Yeah. Well, I think you'll have fun. So thanks for coming.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
I'll see you in a few weeks then.
All right. Bye.
Okay, thanks. Okay, bye.